I only once really bumped into his anima, and I came into the hour and admittedly was a bit in the animus, but not much. And he just started at once, "You are in the animus and one cannot talk to you today, wow," and really shouted at me, and I started to cry, which he hated. And then I got angry and shouted back. And so we shouted at each other for quite a while. And then I went home and cried and was absolutely desperate. And the next morning, the secretary rang up and said, "Professor Jung wants to ask you if you had a minute time to come over at 11 o'clock. And I said, naturally, and I came. And when I entered the house, he was then about 68 or 70. And you know, a big man, he stood up heavily and bowed very politely and said, I'm sorry to ask you to come out, but I wanted to apologize. I was yesterday in the anima. I can't tell you, but something very disagreeable happened to me just before the hour, and I hadn't time to catch myself up, and so I can't tell you, unfortunately, what it is because it's private, but I want to apologize." So then I felt very humble and said, "It's me who has to apologize too." And I must say, when I went home, I thought, now I have much more confidence in that man than before, because I knew if there is a misunderstanding, and in a long relationship there is always once a misunderstanding or, a clash of the negative side, he would always come round, see it at once and come round. So it really helped the relationship in the end. I was glad it happened, because then later when there was trouble, I always thought either it's his fault and then he'll come round, or it's my fault and then I'll have to come round, and that's all there is to it.
You can say the brutality of our race springs more from a lack of differentiation of the anima in men, that men have not differentiated their anima, and if a man has not differentiated his anima, he's liable to terrific outbursts of affect. Everything is cold and reasonable, and suddenly, comes the affect. If a man reacts like that, it means his anima is not worked out.
They are running either from the shadow or very often from animus and anima. That's the big complication between the sexes. If you live with somebody of the same sex, it's the shadow gets constellated. If you live with somebody of the other sex, then the bigger task comes. That's why it's the more valuable relationship, because it's also the bigger task, because that constellates anima and animus. And as the average American nowadays doesn't know yet what that is, whenever animus and anima clash, they run apart. It's finished. They throw it over. If they stuck it out, they would learn a lot about themselves. That doesn't mean that we are not sometimes for divorce. There are situations you better think of a divorce. There are relationships where both partners become destructive to each other, plainly destructive, and then it is better to make a final decision. But there are others where it's just a clash of animus and anima, and if they could become conscious, they could get on again. That is really the characteristic of most negative or split-off complexes. If we reject or split off some complex of our psyche, then it begins to sap our energy secretly, behind our back, so to speak. And then it turns slowly into what is aptly represented by the image of a vampire, something which attacks us in the night and sucks all our blood. People feel they don't know. They come into analysis and they say, "I feel listless, I just feel tired, I just don't want to do anything, I wake up already in the morning depressed, nothing means anything to me anymore." We could answer to them, "You are probably sucked by a vampire, you are bloodless, you have no life impulse, no pleasure in life anymore, no interest or anything." And then you generally find that this vampire is just a split-off complex which has been split off so radically and so powerfully that it can only sap energy anymore. It cannot manifest in any other way anymore. On a primitive level, it appears in men generally as an element of romantic, unreal, mostly sexual fantasies. And you see, for instance, in puberty, when young men are very active and then suddenly they become passive and dreamy and they are not there, and their performance in school goes down tremendously, and one has the feeling, where is that? Where has that young man disappeared? He's in the clutches up to the neck of daydreaming sexual fantasies. In that age it is a normal transition, but if a man gets stuck in indulging in wishful sexual fantasies, he literally falls into the hand of a vampire. He loses his capacity of taking his own life in hand, he loses his willpower, he loses all his male efficiency, and he just daydreams all the time about women and their curves and would-be romantic adventures and so on. He lives in an unreal life. I saw once a man who was 43, still living with his mother, who had never approached a woman. I asked him, what on earth are you doing with your sex? And he gave a secretive smile and didn't confess. He just masturbated wildly every night. Then he dreamt that he was in daytime living an ordinary life, but in the nighttime he was living on a luscious island where he had wild sexual adventures with women. That was the fantasy world into which he had disappeared. In a primitive tribe, one would say such a man has been bewitched. He's bewitched. I once met the dream of a young man who was living still with Mama. He was 29 and had never had a girl in his room. So we seriously discussed the possibility of getting a room outside his mother's home. And he was terrified. He was a very sensitive, delicate boy, and his mother was a very brutal, strong personality, and he was just terrified of the moment to tell Mother, look here, I am going to take a room outside and I'm not going to live with you anymore. And when he was kind of trying to make up his mind, he dreamt that he had to slay the dragon. So in that case, it means actually that though it seems such a, to us, little thing to tell Mother, I have to room, for him that was slaying the dragon. It was overcoming a monstrous neurotic difficulty within himself. His whole mother complex, not only facing the scene of his actual mother, but overcoming also the inertia and the anxiousness of his own mother complex. His mother had sowed in him an anxiousness, a fear of life. He had to overcome a terrific fear of life to make that step. And that is an archetypal motive all over the place, that the young man has to do the heroic deed of killing his mother, or the mother dragon, or the mother demon, which is what is anxious or lazy or afraid of living a masculine life. The anima is the archetype of life, and it is, when the anima is negative, it is the impulse to dream about life and to make wishful fantasies about life instead of living life. And that's why vampires and Draculas and creatures alike always suck one's blood. The blood is the emotional, active psyche in us, the affect psyche. And such people have no activity left, or no life activity left. They just sink into a passive, wishful dream. The dream tries to tell him it's a ghost which is haunting me, because actually he's haunted not by reality, he's haunted by a fantasy, which is draining his whole psychic energy. In past time, there were the innumerable myths of vampires, which fascinated people. Tales retold all over the world. We, for instance, in the Swiss Alps, we have stories that our cowherds high up in the mountain, who have to live there the whole summer alone without having women, every night the Dokali comes, that is a female ghost, comes through the door invisibly and rides them all the night so that they have sexual pollutions, and in the morning they wake up completely exhausted and can't practically move anymore, overwhelmed, so to speak, by sexual fantasies and by the unlived life. These black garments represent a typical feature of an undeveloped inner anima figure. That would mean that his whole capacity of love is mostly autoerotic. When a man has not developed his anima, his feminine side is generally very narcissistic. That's what women painfully feel, that when a man in love is meowing under her window like a tomcat in love, he really loves his own fantasy. He loves his own being in love. But there's a long way for him to learn to love her and not enjoying his own being in love. And if you read in literature a young man, when he generally discovers the experience of love, it's mostly completely autoerotic fantasy, out of which he has, through a painful development, learned to love the woman not as the object of his romantic fantasies, but as a human partner. The devouring mother on the personal level would be the fact that many women who are over-caring for their children try to keep them back from life. It begins by being anxious. Don't do that, it's dangerous. Don't do that, it's dangerous. Don't go to play out with the boys. You could fall and wound, or you get hit over the head. And by trying to keep the children too much in their clutches. And then we speak of devouring mothers. And such mothers also have trouble when their sons and daughters begin to date girls or boys. They say, I'm very much wishing that you married, and I'm very glad, but that girl you bring home now, no, that is not the right girl for you, or that's not the right boy for you. So they keep the children in their clutches, but that is only the foreground of a woman who has exaggerated her maternal protective qualities. If a man has a too close tie to his mother, then he, especially a positive one, then he tends to idealize women. He sees in every woman the Beatrice of Dante, so to speak, or the Virgin Mary. And then such men cannot approach women again with their lower parts, with sexually and in ordinary human life. Or they have a split anima situation. They admire a very unapproachable, lofty, beautiful girl from afar and satisfy their sexual desires with prostitutes and cannot bring the two ends together. They cannot put the princess and the bitch together, so to speak, in their psyche. And that is generally due to a too close tie to the mother in the man. He has to free himself from the mother. That's why, for instance, in one of the famous examples of such a princess in the tower, Rapunzel, she's imprisoned by a witch. It's the mother figure behind the scene, which brings forth the constellation. And then both lovers cannot meet on earth. And only when Rapunzel has come down on earth and he has erred around in the desert in misery and pain, can they finally meet. When a man has a mother complex, he's generally a split anima. Namely, on one side, his feminine side, he worships the feminine image too much. It's a kind of Virgin Mary or feminine Holy Ghost figure, the pure, wonderful woman, so to speak. And the other is the prostitute, with whom he has sex, but whom he thoroughly despises. This kind of split in the anima between the Virgin Mary and the prostitute is typical for the mother complex. And such men then, if they have to approach a woman, they don't know how to do it, because the one they admire too much, she's too pure, you can't stretch out your hand and touch her. And the other is easily conquered, but no partner really, just something to have sex with. And such men have also in their own way trouble to relate to women because of that split anima situation. There one comes to the most ticklish problem of it all. Because the question, he will be inclined to think, there you see, that's exactly what she's doing. She's always taking away my ways of moving about. She's always interfering. And you are not so sure. It might just as well mean that it is a so-called projection, namely that his own feminine side is stealing the car, and that he only projects that onto his wife. He thinks his wife does it. He sees it in her, so to speak, while he's really doing it unconsciously to himself. So that's why if one wants to interpret these dreams correctly, one has to know the whole marital situation, one has to know the wife and have an idea of her objective behavior, and then one can evaluate, no, that is a projection, it's really what this man is doing to himself unconsciously, or it refers really to the wife. And sometimes it also does to both. That's the problem, what we call subjective or objective interpretation. Referring to an outer object, the wife is really stealing the car, or referring to the subject itself is stealing its own car. With his left hand, so to speak, or his feminine unconscious side, he's stealing his own car. Generally, one can say that about, I would say, I have never made a statistic, but I would think that about 85% of the dream motifs are subjective, and that therefore it is recommendable to mostly interpret dreams subjectively, to always say, what is it in me which does that, instead of taking it as a warning against outer people. If somebody dreams of his husband or wife and they look quite differently, they are a different figure, it means the inner wife or the inner husband, in other words, the main animus or anima figure to whom they are, so to speak, always married inwardly. It's the inner marriage and the inner wife. One cannot say that ahead. Generally, when people fall in love like that in 1 second, it is mostly projection, and many marriages are concluded on the basis of complete projection. And then comes, therefore, generally a period of disillusionment where both partners discover that he or she are very different from what they had thought they were. And then comes the great test. Can they now build up a real relationship after the projection has gone, or is nothing left? After the projection is gone, there's nothing left. There are two strangers staring at each other's face and saying to themselves, how could I? And that one can only decide on the dreams. I've very often analyzed couples where, after having worked through the Anima projections, one or both partners dreamt that now they could get married. And they dreamt of a real going to church and having a marriage ceremony and getting married at last. As if one could say the removing of the projection has made it possible to be really related, this time for good. With open eyes, saying yes to each other with open eyes and knowing each other. While before that was a kind of blind infatuation. Well, in the transference, which is an expression which Jung took actually over from Freud, and Freud thought it was purely a projection of the parental image onto the partner and so on, and an Oedipal or Electra complex projected. That's why at the end of a Freudian therapy you cut off, goodbye, we have never known each other. Projections are handed back and goodbye. While we think certainly in the beginning stages of relationship there is generally a lot of projection mixed up with it, and that is responsible for all those love quarrels. I mean, she makes demands which he can't fulfill, and he makes demands she can't fulfill, and animus anima crossing the swords. And I mean, if you tape record a love quarrel, it's the same all over the world, literally. And that is projection. And if people don't run away but work it out and take back all what is projection in it, then appears or is peeled out of all this the true relationship. Now it might be none, and then it would be like the Freudian thing, goodbye, now I see you simply represented that and that in me, and thank you very much, goodbye. Or there might be a tremendous amount of relationship, true relationship built up, which is not the same thing as projection. So you can say that transference implies that it is the beginning stage of still a lot of projection mixed up with it. And therefore all these kind of compulsivenesses, people cry if you don't see them often enough, and childish demands and all that kind of trouble. And then it gets replaced slowly or purified into what you could call an objective relationship. the image of God or a goddess is, if that is projected, it makes for a very, very violent transference, and then slowly one discovers, naturally, no partner can fulfill the role of a god. If you ask the other to be a god or a goddess, you will certainly be disappointed, sooner or later. The peeling of the black anima and her transformation in a white golden anima is the transformation of the loving capacities of a man, a transformation of his eros from a primitive autoerotic fantasy into a true human capacity for love. So this myth shows that masculine intellectual overcoming of the devouring powers of the unconscious is not enough. It has to be done by the way one lives, not by the way one thinks. Just as it wouldn't help the young man who has to take a room for himself to understand that he has a mother complex and that all his neurotic symptoms comes from his mother tie. He has to actually take the other room and stand the battle. Otherwise, at the next occasion, when he runs out of money, he moves back to Mama again. Perhaps he finds a disagreeable landlady in his first room, so he might move back home again. He has to understand why he does it, and that it is vitally essential for him, that it is not just a technical change in his life. And the anima in a man means also his feeling personality, his sensitivity, his awareness of inner things. If a man has a positive relationship to his anima, he is sensitive, he is aware of inner things, he is receptive to the spiritual processes in the depth of the psyche. That is his anima. The anima in her developed form is, in man, the capacity for love, in contrast to the power drive. It is loving for love's sake in the highest form. That's why this woman appears in a medieval castle surrounded by a moat, because that, in medieval time, in the so-called French cour d'amour, courts of love, there was the first time in the Western Christian civilization a realization of the anima. There, each knight elected a woman of his choice, which was not his wife, and who represented his beloved anima figure, and he made poems for her, and he did his heroic deeds for her, and he worshipped her like a goddess. And that at the same time, those men grew out of their barbarian warriors' behavior and became cultivated people, men who could really relate to women, men who cultivated their capacity of love, their sensitivity. And that's why this is the time of the Grail legends, of the troubadours, of the story of Tristan and Isolde, and these love traditions. The church didn't like this development because it led to all sorts of complications, and it made people a bit too independent from her. And so it was suppressed, and interestingly enough, when those cours d'amour were suppressed, the witch hunting began. The feminine became negative, and one began to pursue alluring, interesting women as witches, because one had suppressed a beginning development of love life. That is why when we now are confronted with the problem of renewing the relationship between the sexes and finding new forms of relating between men and women, we have to historically go back to the Middle Ages, to where the problem has been left over in this castle in the moat. There the problem has been deserted and left for a one-sided masculine rational development of the West, and therefore we have to return to that. And for instance, the whole romanticism of the hippie movement was such a first attempt. That's why they were imitated troubadours with music instruments and even revived troubadour music. That was all going back that now the anima development is most important for men and the animus development for women.
A man's mother complex positive mother complex is an infinite gift of heaven. Look at Goethe. What would Goethe be without his mother? It makes creativity, it makes a man creative, it makes a man naturally liking and loving women, it makes a man artistic, all that. The disadvantage of it is that he becomes soft and easily undisciplined, and that he can't stand hardships, that he can display the mannerism of a spoilt boy. And to help it simply means to learn discipline and to not give up when things become disagreeable, to stick to one's gun, all that, to do a bit more training of independent masculinity. That's what it amounts to, get free from the positive mother. Otherwise, the positive mother is like a beautiful cushioned feather bed, and one can become terribly lazy in it. So I would say that's one of the most outstanding negative features of a positive mother complex is softiness and laziness, friendly laziness.
Well, we have not many sociological matriarchies, but I read once a book about a South American Indian tribe where there was actually sociological, not religious, but sociological matriarchy. And there, the women were happy, fat whores, ordering the men about, and the men were lean, submissive, nervous creatures who were planting the fields and doing the work for the women, kind of porters' figures. And positively, wealth, the world of the drives, sexuality, earthly happiness was blossoming. And negatively, there was no spirit whatsoever. A world of total stupidity, so to speak, of only living very agreeably, but not thinking or having any ideas or spiritual realizations at all. And the men accordingly unhappy and submissive and rather poor creatures. But generally these things balance back and forth. There will be another generation of men who will, in male protest again, put the things into a middle position, or try to put the things in a middle position. The ideal seems to be not that either the men dominate or the women dominate, but that there is a kind of equal relationship, a balance of opposites. There is a place for a man to be a man and a woman to be a woman. Otherwise, nature has made them that way. It doesn't need to have an attitude of dominance. You can just as well say, make love to her. Just as much an expression of love. So you can say a man can sometimes break the animus possession of his wife by making love to her. It all depends how he does it. If he has real feelings, it'll reach her. If he acts that way, nothing happens. It only goes wrong. That's why I never advise when I analyze a man to do such a thing, because then he would do it acting. He would act it because I told him, and then it would certainly go wrong. It only goes right if he really has a positive feeling, a wave of positive, warm feeling towards her. He has not to take all that bullshit, because it'll only get worse and worse and worse. But therefore he has to refuse all that nonsense and say, when you talk in that whiny baby way to me, all sorts of nonsense, I'm not even going to listen. But he must at the same time make a gesture that the woman feels, if only she were herself, he would love her. For a man to deal with an animus-possessed woman is to love, to give a hand to the woman to say, I love you, I still love you, and to slap the animus at the same time. So that the woman feels, when I'm myself, he still loves me. When I'm not myself, he gets angry. And by that, the man can help the woman out. Then she begins to notice what is herself and what is not herself. We will see it's the same thing with the anima of a man. All the big transitions in life are in all societies have been accompanied by so-called what Genep calls rite de passage, rites of transition, to make a ritual to help people to make the step over the threshold. Now, the most famous one, which has been studied mostly by ethnologists, is the ritual of initiation, where the young men are initiated into the secrets of the tribal law and into the secrets of sexuality. And they have to leave mother and their home. They are secluded in the bush. They are symbolically devoured by a maternal monster. They are reborn. They have to generally stand a lot of tortures. And then they are generally at the same time instructed with the secret law of the tribe and the religious traditions. And if a young man has undergone all this ritual of transition, then he is afterwards a full member of the tribe, he's a man. And many tribes call the ones who are afraid, who are for some other reason not initiated, they say, he's not initiated, he's an animal. Meaning he has remained completely unconscious, he has remained in an unconscious animal conditions. He has not really made the step to being human. As we know from the life history of Marilyn Monroe, she did not live her own life. She acted all the time the anima of men. Generally, there are women, and that is ultimately due to the power drive. When women discover that if they are beautiful, they can exert a magic power over men, then they take to acting all the time the anima. We are even in our jargon sometimes talking about anima women. Those are women who find out how to act the anima to men. But because this is not love but pure power drive, it is destructive to the men and to themselves. Because it's using the guise of love for worldly power. Such women want to rule the men, they want the men to be all at their feet, and then they naturally are unhappy because they don't feel loved. I remember when I was young, sometimes when a man projected his anima onto me and was pursuing me and giving me presents and so on, I had the distinct feeling, but that fellow doesn't know me at all. He's chasing an image. I wanted to look back. Who is he chasing? It's not me. Me as a human being he doesn't see. And so if a woman falls into the trap of acting out the anima, she can exert a tremendous power over men. But at the same time, inwardly, she's frustrated because those men love her image, they don't love her. So she's really very lonely underneath. And that's what caught up with poor Marilyn Monroe. It works as long as it is an adventure or a love affair. Then she fills out his needs. But when he has to live with her, if he marries her and has to live with her in everyday life, then comes the trouble. She will play the anima to all the other men as well, and he'll not like that. And secondly, he'll suddenly discover that underneath that beautiful mask, there is no human being, there is no warmth, there's no possibility of a human relationship. So to marry an anima figure is most disappointing. These women who play that are called by the French femme fatale, women who ruin men. She is the goddess. And being identified with the goddess is naturally extremely dangerous. That is what we talked about inflation before. And so Marilyn Monroe in reality lost her identity. We can also see it from another aspect, because Marilyn Monroe represented for most of the public, as her own fantasy shows, a feminine goddess. And it is because in the Christian churches the feminine goddess is lacking, that certain women or film stars are so elevated to divine rank and admired so much. Greta Garbo had the same tragic difficulties, that she was too much deified, and she got frightened by it and ran away from it finally. She had enough. So it is also a problem of our civilization, because we have no official goddess to worship. Certain actresses or beautiful women are worshipped like a goddess instead, and they can't carry that projection. They don't know how to carry that projection.
Lovers have fantasies how their bride should be, and if a woman has not a strong feeling of identity, she will very much be tempted to play up to the stage, and then she becomes what we call an anima woman. She plays the role men expect from her and loses her own identity. This is a very widespread and very dangerous thing for women, which generally leads to disaster. You see that in a positive way in Greta Garbo. She was just the anima of thousands of men. She had that certain something which every man was able to project his anima of. But she obviously, in the middle of her life, got a terrible depression and realized that she was losing herself and her own identity by playing the role of the anima and not being herself. That's why she retired so in a depressed and abrupt way completely from the stage and lives now shyly secluded. It has been interpreted as neurotic and so on. I cannot judge that because I don't know enough about her. But the step in itself is very positive. She must have realized that playing the anima is a dangerous game which makes one lose one's own identity. You see the danger already in little children. Mama says, go and brush your teeth and go to bed. And then the little girl says, Papa, will you not play with me? And Papa gets weak, and then she knows how to play that game and put men in her pocket.
If a woman has this tendency of playing the anima to her father's little girl, and playing the anima, she assumes a divine role, because animus and anima are mythological, or in primitive language, divine figures, namely they belong to the dream world and not to outer reality. And therefore, a daughter who is flirting too much with her father and getting into a too close incestuous relationship with her father generally has a certain secret inflation. She assumes the dignity of a queen. She assumes that every man has to be at her feet like father, like she managed to bring forth with father. And she develops a certain haughtiness, feeling to be something special above the crowd, and therefore she becomes unapproachable to ordinary men. Men who try to approach her feel she's a princess, but not somebody you can comfortably take into your bed and have an animal relationship with. You can relate to them, so to speak, only on a high level. And some girls who have that father's princess-like attitude, therefore, are in great danger not to marry or to have difficulties in relating to men. Well, we well know that we are born from genes, and that only the predominance of male or female genes make the gender of a child. And there are even androgynous creatures sometimes where even nature can't make up quite their mind what to produce, a man or a woman. And even every man has breasts and nipples on the breasts and, so to speak, a sketched feminine side, and the woman has a clitoris and a sketched masculine side, and the same is true for the psyche. Not only our body is predominantly male or female, but having the other element in it, our psyche too is predominantly male or female, but contains the other side. The anima has many stages and embraces a great range of psychological facts. Jung once divided it in 4: Eve, Helena, Mary, and Sophia, the wisdom of God. Eve would be the biological woman, and when she appears as an anima, she would be biological sex, the physical attraction, motherhood, the image of the ordinary attractive female. Helena is on a higher stage. She would represent the hetaira, as the Greeks, for instance, developed a type of their form of geishas, the hetaira, cultivated women with whom one had not only a sexual adventure, but with whom one exchanged poetry and philosophical conversations, where the man had also a spiritual companion in the woman, a companionship, together with romantic sex. The next stage is the anima figure in Christianity of the Virgin Mary, which is the highest form of spirituality, but a bit one-sidedly too high up. The Virgin Mary is lacking the dark Eve side of woman, the earthy side of woman. So it is a bit a too lofty ideal. And when the Church abolished Cour d'Amour, they forced the knights to worship the Virgin Mary instead. And at the same time they began the witch hunting. That means the dark side, the shadow side, or the more biological and wilder, the more natural side of the anima is too much excluded from the ideal of the Virgin Mary. And therefore the 4th stage, the wisdom of God, is, as Jung smilingly quoted, is a come down, because wisdom is not most virtuous spirituality. It is closer to life. It would be when a man knows how to love women and knows how to relate to women, but having wisdom at the same time, the wisdom which protects him from their devouring side. The highest form of love is also something with a grain of salt in it.
And what do you mean by that?
I won't say. We went out there to the tower, and out of the bushes suddenly we were standing around kind of, awkwardly, as one does, not knowing what was going to happen. And then out of the bushes came a man, and I was deeply impressed by him. I thought naturally he was a Methuselah, because when you are 18, you think 58-year-old is ready for the cemetery. And then there was one story which he told us. He dived right away into psychology already at lunch. We stayed lunch till supper until late in the evening. That we'll stay the whole day with him. And he told that story, which you can read in the memories, about this girl who was on the moon and had to fight a demon, and the black demon got her. And he pretended, or he told it in a way as if he really had been on the moon and it had happened. And I was very rationalistically trained from school, so I said indignantly, but she imagined to be on the moon, or she dreamt it, but she wasn't on the moon. And he looked at me earnestly and said, yes, she was on the moon. And I thought for a long time. I still remember looking over the lake there and thinking, and either this man is crazy or I am too stupid to understand what he means. And then suddenly it dawned on me, he means that what happens psychically is the real reality. And this other moon, this stony desert which goes around the earth, that's illusion, or that's only pseudo-reality. And that hit me tremendously deeply.